Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us in this post-lunch session. It's been really great to be here. Enormous thanks to the organizers for inviting us. It's been such a great experience, and tomorrow also we're going to have so much that's ongoing. Also, we want to be grateful. This is a very kind of risky enterprise to undertake, writing a biography, and for reasons that we'll explain. But we're so grateful to Cambridge University for this opportunity to be able to write this, because there wouldn't be many publishers who would kind of, take this up, given the kind of, spaces that he inhabited. So it's really fantastic to publish this with Cambridge. So let me start with first why we think why we thought this biography should have been written. And we both have a Ranchi connection. I grew up in Ranchi, which used to be Bihar. And if you are from northern India, at that point of time, if you wanted to learn Hindi in a very serious way and you needed a dictionary, everybody had a Bulcke dictionary, and in their homes, in institutions, in offices. I don't know if any of you talk to the older generations, particularly from northern India, they'd say, yes, the dictionary was there. It was the English to Hindi dictionary, the Shabdakosh, and it was called the Bulcke dictionary. And I remember being very curious about it. How is it that it has a foreign naming person who's actually authored a dictionary? And then there are areas within the central, Ranchi is the capital, and in the city, right in the heart of the city, there is an area called the Camille Bulcke Path. And there is also the Manresa house there, where that is the traditional home of the Jesuits. And there is this bust of Father Bulcke there with a little chaupai of Ramcharitmanas. So if you walk in and you go and pay respects, and there's a grotto and you pray there, and you kind of wonder, what is this man wearing this padre robe, his bust there, and with a quote from the Ramcharitmanas. So you're really curious about him. And then something really interesting happened in 2018 when his remains were brought from the Nicholson Cemetery in Delhi, and it was taken to Ranchi. Now, this is a very tribal tradition where they dig up the ancestors as they move from one place to another. So in order to honor him, the fact that, it was, as we called it, it was a kind of a ghar wapasi of a different kind, where he was taken, his remains were taken from Delhi to Ranchi, reburied on the premises of St. Xavier's College there, where he worked for all his life. So it was quite an event, 3 days. A lot of his students, colleagues, his members of the clergy attended, and everybody talked of him, about his life, what the work that he did. And it was so interesting to attend that, and this is 2018. And you realize that there wasn't any kind of source, like a complete source, his story. We heard pieces of his story, and that made us really curious about why there wasn't a book, why the church perhaps had not taken so much interest in him, and how is it that we could contribute as residents of Ranchi. So this was a Belgian missionary who came all the way from Belgium to India in the 1930s and left a remarkable legacy. So maybe, Ravi, you should talk about his life story a little bit.
Thank you, Swati. The remarkable part is you pick up a Hindi to English dictionary, and the compiler's name is Camille Bulcke. It doesn't even fit an English name because it's a Belgian name. And indeed, he was a Belgian who was born in a very small village in 1909. And he wanted to become an engineer, which he did. He got a degree in civil engineering. But while he was doing his civil engineering, he got the message, or as he says, a light flashed in front of me on a book that I was reading, and I realized that I'm going to become a monk and not become a householder. So he waits for another year, gets his engineering degree, goes to his parents and says, I've decided to become a missionary, and I don't want to be a householder. And the family had a lot of hopes from this man because becoming an engineer, he was the first man to go to a degree of engineering from his village. And they thought he's going to bring them material goods and the family will be in a good space. But Belgium has this tradition of young men taking up religious duties instead of going into the worldly affairs. So they accepted it. So after having this degree, he goes to the seminary in Drongen, and for next 4 years he trains there, becomes a brother. He's asked after his ordination as Brother Bulcke, would you like to serve the mission in Belgium, or would you like to go somewhere else? And Bulcke, of all the places, says, I want to go to India. And even in India, I want to go to Chota Nagpur, which is what Ranchi and Jharkhand is all about. One should be shocked that in 1934 he is talking like this, when we had no Google Maps or anything. How much would he know about India? So there is a little backside story to this. He found inspiration from another Christian missionary by the name Father Constance Levens, who had come from Belgium and who is supposed to be the biggest missionary in Chota Nagpur region. He converted a lot of tribals to Christianity. And he was not giving them incentives so as to become a Christian, what people call material benefits directly. All these people in the middle of 19th century or later 19th century were still against the colonial administration. They will lose their land, they will lose their livelihood. And Constant Clemens will ask them to come to him, and he will fight cases on their behalf in the courts and get them relief. And doing that, he managed to get a lot of people convert to Christianity. And Bulcke thought this is an amazing journey of a Belgian saint, and I must follow him. And that's why he decided to come to Ranchi. And he comes to India in 1935. And there is a reason I'm saying 1935, because 1935 is the year, anybody who has looked at modern Indian history would know, is the Government of India Act comes, which gives nothing but voting rights to Indians who were still under colonial rule, to elect the local government bodies. And 1935 again is also an year when 100 years before that, Macaulay had written that Minutes of Indian Education and had said any scientific education must be done in English. Bulcke comes to India, and the first thing he thinks, every signboard on the street of a small town Ranchi, starting from a station all the way to Manresa House where he was to be based, is in English. So for a moment he thinks, am I in England or am I in India? So reaching Ranchi, he decides that why are these people so enamored with a colonial language instead of their own mother tongue? And again, there's a background to it. When Camille was growing up and studying in the university, entire Flanders region, which used to speak Flemish, which was his mother tongue, was under French occupation. So unless you know French as a language, unless you embrace French etiquettes and manners, there is no hope in hell for you to get any professional degree or assignment. And he resented that. In the university, in the first year, he became a very active language activist protesting for Flemish. And there's a small story which says when the professor used to address the class in French, Camille will start singing songs in Flemish with his friends to protest. He comes to India, so his idea that a language of local people must be respected always remained with him. So he comes to India, joins a small school near Ranchi. And imagine this, he's a science and math student teaching in a remote Jharkhand small town. And he's sitting in the Hindi classes with his own students to learn Hindi. So after teaching physics and math, he goes and sits with the same students in the same class to learn Hindi. And in no time, he becomes such an expert that the missionaries started taking notice of it. So they sent him to a proper Hindi learning to Hazaribagh under the tutelage of a Hindi scholar by the name of Dutt Shastri. Few months, Camille spends with him, and then the teacher calls him Chalta Firta Shabdakosh, which means a walking dictionary. So he had that flair of picking up language so beautifully. But then, because he had come to India as brother, he had to be ordained and become the father, so he take the theological training. And after doing that, he comes back to Ranchi, and instead of taking the missionary work, he tells his authorities, I want to actually learn Hindi and have a proper degree in Hindi. And then he travels all the way to Allahabad, which at that time was the best Hindi department in the whole of the country, and meets the professor there, Dr. Dhirendra Verma, and convinces Dhirendra Verma that I should be admitted to this course, does his MA, then he goes for his PhD. And his love for Hindi then brings him across Tulsidas. So the first time when he reads Tulsidas, Ramcharitmanas and Vinay Patrika, as a devout Christian, and he remained a devout Christian all his life, he finds Tulsidas' idea of devotion to Ram and how he defines his bhakti, as we know, unbelievable. And he always says, one thing that I will never have is the steadfast devotion that Tulsi has, and I want to emulate him. So he does his PhD. He wants to do his PhD for the devotion of Tulsidas, but just for collecting information, he gets all the sources all over the world. His guide says, forget Tulsidas, you have got enough for a whole PhD. So he does a PhD in the origin of Ramkatha, the genesis and origin of Ramkatha, and then he gets a PhD, comes back to Ranchi and teaches in St. Xavier's College for the next 32 years because he dies in 1982. This is in a nutshell. As a biographer, I'm trying to speak as little as possible, but can't fit in less. Thank you.
I think the difficulty of academy-trained social scientists is to write a biography of this kind, where you're telling somebody else's story. You're trained in social sciences research methods, right? How do you do it? And and Ravi, of course, has written the biography of former Prime Minister of India, Chandrasekhar ji. So he had some idea. But for us, the challenge was, how do you get material for this? So although we did hear, stories about Father Bulcke, but how do you actually dive into the archives? And so we got in touch with the missionaries, and they would not actually, they were not very keen to share the archives. And we hope that somebody will take it up. One amongst you will write it, maybe somebody else will, and will get access to those archives. But we depended a lot on the interviews that we were able to do. Camille's own work, I mean, he has left so many essays and translations and his own work that we also, knowing Hindi, were able to translate ourselves. So I'm just trying to tell you that, and it was also in the midst of COVID, where we had also pressure from our publishers. We were delaying everything. We couldn't go to Belgium. But just to tell you how difficult it was to acquire all the material that we needed for this book. And the one thing that I'd say is that, when you write a biography, it's not always that you actively choose a subject. The subject chooses you. You're drawn to a character. There's some kind of a relationship that you forge. And for us, Camille was that. But let me briefly talk about his contributions, right? And of course, we have to be very brief because we want to have some engagement from people here. But his contributions are enormous. You've heard about the dictionary. I mean, he was a lexicographer. Writing a dictionary those days, I mean, it's such an arduous task. In fact, there's a mention in our book that he said that if you wanted to punish someone, then you tell them to actually write a dictionary or compile a dictionary. But apart from that, what are the things, Ravi, that we can tell our audience that he did, actually, very briefly?
One way, he was a real Hindi enthusiast. And we will, in the end, address why this biography is in English when he was such a big Hindi aficionado. He writes in one of his articles that when I came to Jharkhand, every church service, even if local tribals used to come, will be in English. If the local people don't understand, it is their problem, because the priest will speak in English. Every ritual is done in English. Every prayer, every hymn is done in English. And then he said, I read the old translations of Bible that were available. And in his own words, he says, anybody who reads this translation will have an aversion for Christianity, not any affection for Christianity. So he decides that what is going on, and then he does, let's do something about it. He makes a glossary of all the technical terms that the local, not the foreign missionaries can use to speak in Hindi. And then from that, he goes on to build a whole dictionary. He translates the whole hymns and prayers and rituals and everything else that has to be done in the church in Hindi. And then he takes up the challenge of translating the Old Testament into Hindi. And before he died, he was doing the New Testament translation into Hindi. He was a person who could understand Aramaic of all the languages, which is what old Christian text is written. He was very fluent in Latin and French. So he has done enormous work for translation. One thing that he has done is, because he loved Tulsidas more than anything else, he said, my biggest pillar of my life is Jesus Christ, because he is what he is to me, and then comes Tulsidas. He has done a lot of work on Tulsidas, and he has tried to explain to people what is the devotional path of Tulsidas, and he says, I have everything. Only thing I lack is the steadfast devotion to the chosen deity that Tulsi has for Ram. I want to have it for Christ.
And that makes me actually emphasize that in the book we pointed out what he said very clearly, that I am not, he was not a Ram Bhakt. So people make the mistake of saying, oh, here's a Christian priest who's a Ram Bhakt. He was very clear that I'm a Tulsi Bhakt. And he kept insisting that when I go to the heavens after I'm gone, I'd rather meet Tulsi as the first person that so he was quite enamored of that writing. But just to let you know that we have tried to avoid a very hagiographical account. I mean, it's difficult, but we've tried to kind of also point out that it's a complex story. It's a story of someone who was a Hindi purist, right? He's talking about Hindi language as the only language. He wasn't very keen on the dialects of Hindi. He used to chide people for not using what he considered cliched Hindi, or the right way to say or use words in Hindi. And he was operating in Jharkhand. Now, do remember, Jharkhand is a land of multiple tribal languages, and he was not keen on those tribal languages either. Belgium, he came from Belgium. It has a very brutal story of colonialism. So although he was very sensitive to colonialism here, and, you know, oh, the Indians are only enamored of English language, but he didn't talk about Belgium colonialism in Africa, for example. You know, I'm an academic. I teach post-colonial politics, and to me that silence is stark in all his writings. Politics of India, 1930s to 80s, you know, we are talking about someone who is the emergency, or think about the movement in JP movement in Bihar. I mean, there was so much happening in India at that time, and he maintains a distance, or at least thinks he does, and we've tried to mention that. So he doesn't, and his understanding of Hinduism, of course, came from the Bhakti Kal, the descriptions from Tulsi's writings, Tulsidasa's writings that he picked up, but he was not, he didn't delve deep into that. And I think all the people in Allahabad, his friends in the Hindi world, Nirala, Mahadevi, you know, everybody, Bachchan, Pant, who he interacted with, all of them understood his limitations, but they kind of also indulged him, because here was a foreigner trying to learn and invest his time and energy learning Hindi. So there was some limitations in how he saw his own location within India, but he believed that he was an Indian. He was quite sad at the fact that, you know, there was a plan once to send the missionaries back. He wanted to live and die in India. He took Indian citizenship, and very few people know he was a Padma Bhushan. His services to Hindi language has been recognized by the government of India. So there's enormous amount of work that he did with a legacy that can still be debated, and we can endlessly talk about it. But I want to finally ask you to tell us a little bit more about why we write in English, and then maybe open up to the audience.
This is a dilemma, and this is what I mentioned. If he was such a great affectionate of Hindi, and I will just say a very small anecdote, though I am running out of time, but I will still say that. Bulcke was very fond of lending books to the girl student, and the reason was, even at that time, St. Xavier's College did not take girl students. So he always used to give them books, and his room was always open, his library was always open, and he used to say the boys are not very honest, so I wouldn't give them. I trust the girls, they come back and give it to me, back to me. And they used to call him Baba Bulcke, Baba as in Father Bulcke in Hindi. One of the days, a girl student was working with him in his room, and one of her relative came. And Bulcke, as usual, I'll have to speak something in Hindi, forgive me for that, asked him, so you want to take this girl with you, who are you? I can't let her go just like that. So casually, the visitor says, मैं उसका uncle हूँ, means I am her uncle. In English it sounds all good, but Hindi if you say मैं उसका uncle हूँ, Bulcke was extremely angry. Uncle, what uncle? Mama ho, chacha ho, phupa ho, mausa ho. Uncle has multiple shades in Hindi. He said, why can't you use one of these and you have to be an uncle? So he was that kind of a purist with Hindi. But when I'm claiming that he has done so much work for Hindi, why this book is in English? Two reasons. One, personal hubris, you can say that. And second, we could not find a single book written on Bulcke anywhere. There is a small Sahitya Academy book in Hindi written by his long-term collaborator, Professor Dineshwar Prasad in Ranchi. But there is not a single book written on a man who has done really different and difficult work as a missionary, talking about Ram, talking about Tulsi, talking about Hindi. I don't think the missionaries enjoyed that. And probably that is the reason when we wanted to go and get the archive, they said, too difficult, we can't let you have it. Or it is too hard for us, you can't have it. Because he had those difficult discussions with them. Very few of his colleagues are left, some of his students are left who are in the mission, and they said Bulcke was an odd man out. He was an odd man out because he could not discuss theology with his other missionary brothers. He was not into conversion because he didn't have time for it, and he will only do his own work. So in the evening, people will find it very difficult to start a conversation with him. Second thing that I want to emphasize is, and this is the new trend, and a very welcome trend for people like us who speak Hindi, and that's the first language we learn. In recent years, you will find there is a trend of Hindi writers finding their biographies are being written in English, surprisingly. And recently, I have come across 3 of such works, and I am sure all of you would know the names, even if you have not read them. One of them is Rahul Sanskritayan, who did so much work for Buddhism, and everyone knows his name. Another one is on Sachidanand Hiranand Vatsyayan. In a small, we call him Agyeya. And the third one that recently has come is Nirmal Verma. All these 3 are dons of Hindi literature, and their life stories have come in English. So it is something that is recently emerged. And I do want people to know about Bulcke, even if he was working in Hindi or in a small town or Jharkhand, that there was somebody who did a very different and very striking work, and that is why this biography. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think we'll stop here and take some comments and questions. Yeah. Yes, sir. Yes, if there's a microphone, yeah.
Well, congratulations on what I'm sure will be a wonderful read. I was struck by what you said about his remains being moved from Delhi to Ranchi.
Yeah.
What was the attitude of the church to because it normally doesn't happen, although I can think of the case of St. Francis Xavier from China all the way to Goa. But what was the attitude of the church to their following what appears to be a tribal tradition?
Yeah, I mean, the church in Ranchi is very tribalized, and, in the sense that there's after all, the church today also, most of the clergy are tribal people. So I think they carry those traditions into the church, I would say. But also, this was a time in 2018 when there was a great interest that came back in Camille Bulcke. We want to emphasize that for a very long time, the church had ignored Camille Bulcke because he did not serve the purpose that Constant Levens did. Levens today is being, canonized. He's on his way to being canonized in Rome, but there is no such effort for Bulcke. A few years ago, if you talk to the clergy, they'd be really uncomfortable because he was talking about Tulsidas or Hinduism. It made them very uncomfortable. But I think 2018 there was a revival. I think this process had gone on for many years to bring him back to tribal, and I think the tribal identity movement also plays a role here, where the idea is that he was one of our own. He set up the Department of Hindi and Sanskrit at Xavier, so let's get him here. So I think they did it with great fanfare, although I would still say that he sits very uneasily within the church. He's not the Constant Levens here or Francis Xavier. Yeah. Thank you, sir. Yes.
Yeah, I think the first time I've heard of him, sorry, because I think he's somewhat like a maverick or an odd man out, as you're told, not accepted by both the sides.
Yes.
Because the clergy, of course, they would have seen he's trying to be too much of a native or something, whatever. And probably the language speakers, the Hindi language writers, and somebody's trying to teach us our own language, because there would have been, one of the pioneers in Hindi and English dictionary, but people would have thought, okay, here is somebody who's coming from outside and trying to teach our own language. And of course, he was really good at it, but it's hard to get accepted by both the sides.
Yeah.
So he was sort of, as you told, in the middle, neither here nor there. But he has left indelible imprint on the tribals. And also, probably since he worked mostly among the tribals, probably the majority of people who were Hindus, saw him as somebody who's trying to winnow the tribals by converting them. That was his job, or what. He didn't do that also fully, but probably in the sense not accepted by both the sides. I can understand. It was a real maverick, I think.
Yeah, maverick. And if I can just say this, that the Hindus who are interested in Ramkatha and that kind of writing, dharmic writings, his writings won't sit very easily.
They could not accept that.
No, absolutely not. He's been critiqued a lot, and we have tried to bring that in the book. His for example, his take on incarnation, how he understood Rama or Krishna, was very different to what mainstream Hindu thought would be. So it was what he understood from a very Christian perspective. But for us, he was a cultural risk taker, someone whose story is very important for our times, and it was about time that we told his story. But thank you for that.
Yeah, misunderstood by both the sides.
Yes,
probably,
absolutely. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I think the gentleman has already asked part of my question. So, I mean, from what I've not read the book, and I'm looking forward to read the book about him, but I've heard about him in the scholarly circles. I'm very curious that he was not someone who just appreciated the literature and the things, but he also, as you mentioned, he wrote about the narrative structures, the concept of this thing, which were received, in many ways, right, like by the scholars and the religious people. I'm very curious to know how much of the Abrahamic template, like coming from that sort of a thing, affected his perception and his way of approach to the text itself.
Yeah, I'll let Ravi have the last word because we're going to run out of time. Ravi, you can answer that. Yeah.
Okay. Not in the later part, but in 1950s, he has written several articles, scholarly articles in English, which he has said that clearly says that you cannot accept the Avatarvad of Hinduism because it cannot be taken as something which is scientific, which can be proven. Well, his view is very Christocentric, in which says that Christ was a savior. It can be proven and traced in the history, but Rama and Krishna and so on cannot be traced in, and there is no authentic source. And the second thing that he says, the canonization of saints is done through a very proper process. But in India, anybody can become a saint. So there is no process there. So as a Jesuit and as a European modernist, he believed in the process, a rigorous process. It doesn't matter if the process itself is very convoluted, but there has to be a process. So you are right there that he had those issues in understanding the Hindu cosmology, so as to say. Yes, thank you.